It's there. There are examples of actually, very distressing, very grotesque examples of anti-Semitism, but they are rare, in my opinion. And those people who are not part of the community view these things with disproportionate frequency. They're not really witnessing the day-to-day activities of faculty and students, which have nothing to do with that.
How bad is the anti-Semitism problem at Columbia, at Barnard, Columbia, in your opinion?
I think that most people, students, faculty, are not anti-Semitic in the slightest. That's my view. But there have been incidents that are quite clearly anti-Semitic, and the one that I mentioned in my post from this morning is the interruption of a class on the history of modern Israel early in the semester, first week of classes, where a group of students disrupted a class and circulated flyers. And those flyers actually were quite grotesque. They involved violent imagery, a boot stomping on a Star of David, an Israeli flag burning, and various statements that are crude and that I won't repeat here. But so you have examples of these, and of course, given the social media landscape we live in, they get amplified and distributed, and so my answer to your question is it's there. There are examples of actually, very distressing, very grotesque examples of anti-Semitism, but they are rare, in my opinion. And those people who are not part of the community view these things with disproportionate frequency. They're not really witnessing the day-to-day activities of faculty and students, which have nothing to do with that. And so they take an outsized place in the imagination of those who are forming opinions about Columbia and about Barnard and about higher education in general. So I would say it's there. There are plenty of examples of it, but I would say that its perceptions of its presence in the country at large is possibly out of proportion with its prevalence.
Let me play the devil's advocate here for a minute.
Yeah.
So, supposing the U.S. invades Iraq in 2003, and I don't like it, and I go on campus and I have a rally and I burn an American flag and I say the empire, it's a fascist, militaristic, whatever. What would happen to me? Nothing.
That's right.
I'm protected by explicit Supreme Court rulings. So the burning an American flag is not a punishable offense. It's
That's
an
correct.
expression of sentiment. But if I burn an Israeli flag and I upset my Jewish students and faculty members of my community because it intimidates them, it makes it seem as if I'm anti-Zionist, I'm pro-Hamas, that's going to be enjoined. How can that be justified?
I take your point. Let me distinguish between the flag burning and the boot stomping on the Star of David. Star of David is not a symbol that is exclusively associated with Israel. It's associated with the religion. So
fair point.
So that I think is different. That I think it's more reasonable to describe that as being quite clearly anti-Semitic. It seems like it to me.
Mm-hmm.
But your point is well taken. This is addressed squarely by Eli Lake's tweet. He considers Khalil to be an apologist for a terrorist group, and despite that, he thinks that unless he's committed a crime, that he ought not to be deported. That he ought to have due process, and that the speech alone, even support for a terrorist organization, does not warrant this kind of treatment. And the fact that he happens to be a green card holder rather than an American citizen is not really relevant to our judgment of this fact. And I think that this is an important point. I think that we should think about why we have and we value the First Amendment. I think there's two ways to look at it. One way is to say, look, American citizens have certain rights. This is one of them. People who are not citizens who may be visiting the country don't have those rights, and so it's okay to treat people differently based on their status, their citizenship status. The other way to look at it is we have the First Amendment because it's good for us, because the freewheeling debate that it encourages, the ability to voice the most extreme positions, can actually be instructive, can teach us something. Engaging with those views can help us understand our own views, and so on. The arguments are very familiar to you. If the reason that we have and we value the First Amendment is because it does something very good for us, even when we have to listen to some things that are deeply unpleasant, then whether or not someone is a citizen becomes irrelevant. Anybody who's making a statement that has, political valence and that challenges us to think about our own preconceptions has value. And that's a very different way to think about free speech, in my opinion. And that's the view that Lake is advancing. He absolutely detests the speech. But if one takes the point of view that it's part of the American tradition because it's good for America, then the citizenship status becomes irrelevant. And that's my position.
I was under the impression that the protections of the Bill of Rights did apply universally to residents in the United States, regardless of their citizen. Congress shall make no law.
Yeah.
is a prohibition against making a law that would bear on anybody, not only citizens.
Well, that's true, Glenn. But there's also an act of Congress that allows for the deportation of green card holders if the Secretary of State were to decide that some of their speech or their actions is contrary to U.S. foreign policy interests, and that ought to be unconstitutional based on the argument that you just made, but it hasn't been found to be. So that law is on the books. Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, can decide that somebody has said something that is contrary to U.S. foreign policy interests, and the law allows him to deport them, even if they're a green card holder. So, yeah, there are conflicting statutes here. And I think it has to be resolved. And I think actually it's a very good thing that the courts are looking at.